Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
He interviewed every British Prime Minister from Edward Heath to David Cameron, 8 in total. And he's broiled in Belfast with the giants of Irish politics, from the Reverend Ian Paisley to, well, everybody else. He's even Ed Sheeran's cousin.
He hosted the Krypton Factor at peak time on ITV for 18 years, attracting at its peak 18 million viewers.
He's TV royalty, and though we're Republicans here, he's welcome on board the Sputnik. Mr. Gordon Burns, what a career you have had. I mean, you're in a way our Larry King, whom we interviewed not that long ago. How did you get into the media business, first of all?
Well, being a Larry King is high praise indeed. I don't think I'm quite in that level, but thank you. I come from a line of journalists, and the same on my mother's side. Her father and her brother were all journalists and editors of local newspapers. But I didn't want to be that particularly, but I was at school. You'll be sad to hear it was a public school in Northern Ireland, but that's not my fault. But that was a rugby-playing school. Fiercely rugby playing. They wanted to win the Schools Cup every year, which is the equivalent of the FA Cup in schools rugby in Northern Ireland, a big, big thing. And I only wanted to play football. I wanted to don the green jersey of Northern Ireland.
So far.
I idolised the Northern Ireland football team with the likes of Danny Blanchflower as a captain, Jimmy McElroy, Harry Gregg, all those guys. And so I formed a rebel soccer league. You like this bit? I formed a rebel soccer league at school. And we played in the holidays and after school and things like that. And as a result of that, because we had league matches and goal scorers, I decided to write a magazine which would have match reports, league tables, top goal scorers, the editor's page where I could express my opinion. I had a guy writing me a diary piece, and I hand wrote all this, and I handed it to my father. And my father was editor of Hansard in the Stormont Parliament, so he took it up to his secretary. No computers, obviously, in those days. She typed it up on stencils, ran it all off. My dad brought back all the separate pages, and I put them all together, stapling them, and charged the princely sum of 3 pence, which is probably around 20p or something like that today, and sold it at school. And that money helped pay for our bus fares to away matches and buying the kit and all that sort of stuff. And one day at school, the headmaster summoned me to his study, which was usually bad news. So I was on my way wondering what on earth I'd done, what was going to happen. And when I went into his study, he was behind this desk, and I could see my magazine, my football magazine, on his table. So I thought, oh, no, this is going to be all right, bit of praise here. And he leaned forward and he picked it up. You can see it to this day. It was the turning point of my young life. He picked it up between his forefinger and his thumb, just like that. And he said, "Are you responsible for this, Burns?" And I said, thinking I was getting praise, well, yes, indeed, sir. Yes, I write that. And about every 3 weeks it comes out. And he said, "Have you got a license to sell this in the school?" Oh, and I thought, what? I mean, I was young and innocent. Sorry, sir, I didn't realise you needed a license. He said, "Well, this is banned. You will never bring this into school again. It is banned. Do not do it again." And he dropped it in the bin, just like that. And I left deflated. But I have a bit of fighting spirit in me. So I thought when my next edition was ready, I brought it to school and sold it 3 feet outside the main gate of school. It was now a banned magazine.
Of course,
it was like Penthouse.
Always goes to the top of the bestseller list.
So they were stuffing them in there and down the back of their trousers or whatever to go into school with the banned magazine. And the Belfast Telegraph got to hear about it, the evening paper in Northern Ireland that everybody read at the time. And they asked me to come in and do an interview, which stupidly I did, as it nearly got me expelled. And it was when I walked up the stairs and into the reporter's room of the Belfast Telegraph, and there were 8 journalists.
Ink entered your blood.
Ink, ink pervaded the building. You
Yeah.
could smell it.
Yeah.
The building shook with the machinery in the basement, churning around, getting the later editions out. There were about 8 journalists sitting around there, tightly squeezed into desks, typing away and pulling sheets of paper out and yelling, "Boy!" And then a boy would run and get it and run down to the subs room.
Wow.
And the copy takers were all against the window there, taking the stories from people out in the field. You could smell the ink. You could feel the machinery thundering. And at that moment, I thought, this is for me. I want to be a journalist. And I battered the editor of the Telegraph for 3 years. He kept making me go back and do exams until he gave me the job.
Fantastic. And you moved eventually into hard news, of which sadly there has been plenty in the north of Ireland, into the political sphere. What did you think of the giants like Paisley and Hume and others? How were your relations with them?
Well, we moved a fair bit on from when I went to the Belfast Telegraph, then went to England to sport in BBC, and then I came back to Ulster Television to do sport, as sports editor, in fact. And it was in 1969, 2 years after I rejoined UTV,
The beginning of the
that
civil
the troubles
rights
began.
struggle.
And the presenter of the evening news programme walked out over some contract dispute, and I was the filler for 2 days, which became a week, which became 2 weeks. And then they said, it's going, well, do it. But no troubles hadn't started, so I thought I could cope because I was more a sports journalist. And the great thing about being in at the beginning of a huge event like the Troubles in Northern Ireland is you go with the story. So at the end of every programme, the politicians came up to the green room. And being Ireland, many of them liked to knock a few back. And we would be there for an hour or 2 hours after programmes, having a few drinks and talking to them. And you learnt more and more what was going on behind the scenes. So you grew with the story and with the politicians as they grew.
Now you moved from the political jungle in Ireland to the political jungle in Britain, where you began to interview bigger beasts, prime ministers, eight prime ministers.
Yeah.
Well, if I could just preempt that by saying my first ever interview with the Prime Minister, which is probably the most important one I ever did and the one I'm still proud of this day, was in my final year with Ulster Television. It was 1973, and my editor, unbeknown to me, had put in a request for to interview Ted Heath as the Prime Minister, knowing he would never get it because they don't ever do it. So imagine his surprise when he got this message back saying, Mr. Heath will do it tomorrow morning, 11 o'clock at Downing Street. During that interview, when the Prime Minister had revealed that security would remain with Westminster, which was a huge thing for Northern Ireland. This was historic stuff. It meant Mr. Faulkner had got it all wrong, and he was really heavy on Faulkner. And I used the phrase, but Prime Minister, the loyalists say if they don't have control of security, then they will wreck this whole proceedings. And he lost his temper. And he looked at me, and it's very frightening for a young guy like me then in Downing Street with the Prime Minister going red and foaming at the mouth almost, saying, do you realise the offence you're causing to the people of this country by referring to these people as loyalists? There are no more disloyal people in the whole of the United Kingdom than those people who don't accept the decisions of the Sovereign Parliament of Westminster. And I'm proud of myself for the way I thought in that moment when I was sort of bit down by that. I said to him, so are you saying that the Vanguard movement, led by the Reverend Ian Paisley and Mr. William Craig, that they are disloyal? And he couldn't say yes. That would have been civil war in Northern Ireland. These were the most loyalist people to the Crown and all the rest of it. And he sputtered, well, I'm saying the people you say are disloyal are loyal, are in fact disloyal unless they accept the Parliament, etc. And he was all over the place, and it hit every front page.
Well done, you.
Paisley raised it in the House of Commons the next day. They sent telegrams to the Queen. It was mega.
Well, that was you made, Gordon. You could have stayed in that front line of political reporting, but you went on Krypton Factor instead. How does that happen? How does that jumping of the shark happen from a hard news man to the Krypton
Factor? I tried not ever to lose the hard news side. I did lots of politics with Granada Television. I was the commentator on the ITV network for any of the party conferences or the TUC conference in Blackpool when they were in our territory. So I had all that when suddenly the Krypton Factor came along. It was advised by a pal of mine called Jeremy Fox, who is the son of Sir Paul Fox, who's a great icon of television. And he dreamt it up. and he couldn't get anyone to present it, although he'd won a network slot. The guy who was going to do it dropped out. But he persuaded me that it would be 1 year, don't worry about it, you can still do all the rest. So I thought, well, I'll give it a go, I'll try anything. So I did it.
And it went for 18 years,
years.
which is an aeon in television times nowadays.
It's unbelievable, especially when there's no
And
cash
equally,
prize.
it got
Yeah, the
18
viewership,
million
yeah.
viewers, which is literally undreamable.
Yeah.
It was number 2 in
Anton
this
Deck would
television.
dream of that.
Well, television's changed a lot there. There are far more stations now and so on, but there weren't that many in those days. But it was number 2 in the national top 20 at that stage, but just behind Coronation Street.
I have to ask, you've interviewed Margaret Thatcher. Can you just quickly tell us how she was like, really? Did she reveal her
I
true...
interviewed Margaret Thatcher 3 times. I interviewed her, well, I was sort of metaphorically handbagged by her in one of my interviews. She'd agreed to do an interview for Granada local television, and she never did regional interviews, but she owed a favour to my co-producer of the show, and she agreed to do it. And I was going down to interview her about Northern Ireland matters in Downing Street, about the northwest of England matters in Downing Street. And by good luck, or whatever you want to call it, it wasn't good luck for the people involved. I don't know whether you remember, we're going back probably into the late 70s, or early 80s, the incident where Iranian situation where hostages were
Yes,
taken,
yes.
and the
SES,
Americans,
rescue,
Americans
yeah.
sent in their commandos, and
made
the
a movie of
helicopters
it.
crashed, if you remember.
Oh, yes, to release the hostages, yes.
Right, and that crashed. It
October
was
surprise.
huge, and the American president was Jimmy Carter, and Carter went on television that weekend, calling on the world to impose huge sanctions on Iran and call on Mrs. Thatcher to lead the way in Europe. So everybody wanted to interview her on Monday, and we had this interview booked. So we waited to be cancelled. We were just a mere local station. And we got the message that Mrs. Thatcher has had hundreds of requests for interviews, Panorama, News at 10, you name it. She's not doing any. I mean, all right, fair enough. Except for Granada televisions. The message came, she said she was a woman of her word, and she'd given us her word she'd do an interview, so she'll do an interview. So I had to change my interview because everybody was now booking my transcript. All the nationals, papers, everybody was booking the transcript. So we sat down and I waded in with the first question thinking, you can make a name for yourself here, Gordon. This is your moment. You know, Prime Minister. I tried to look my most serious. Prime Minister. You'll have seen the awful events of the weekend, and President Carter has called upon you to lead the way in imposing sanctions on Iran. So can I ask you outright, will you be imposing sanctions on Iran? And she said, before I answer that, let me say this, how appalling the situation was and how terrible Iran and all that sort of stuff, etc., etc. And our hearts go out all the way. She didn't answer it. And I said, but Prime Minister, you haven't answered the question, which is, are you imposing sanctions, as President Carter has asked you to do? And she said, I thought I just answered that. Let me tell you again. And off she went. So I burst in the middle and said, Prime Minister, you're not answering the question. The question I asked you is, she said, don't interrupt. Did I interrupt your question? No, I did not. Do not interrupt my answer. I said, well, you're not answering. Well, if you listen, you'll get your answer. And she never answered.
Wow.
Wow. Gordon Burns, thanks for coming.
It's been a
on
pleasure.
this
Thanks for
Sputnik.
having me.
you.
Thank you.
Prince Charming is in town. What could possibly go wrong? Don't miss it.
Welcome back to Sputnik. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is the same age as Gayatri, but he's not nearly so nice. He incarcerates his relatives in the gilded cage of the Ritz-Carlton, amid reports, unconfirmed, that he hangs them upside down until their ill-gotten gains fall out before trousering them alongside his own.
A £1 million advertising blitz has been spent putting lipstick on this particular monster to mark his arrival in London, to dine with the Queen and to do his best to suborn British state policy.
Gone is all talk of dictatorship, of Islamist extremism, of naked military aggression against neighbouring states, of sponsoring terrorism and fanaticism around the world. No rogue state, this royal absolutist dictatorship.
Mind you, on International Women's Day, we were invited to rejoice that thanks to #MBS, women in Saudi Arabia can now drive cars and go to the cinema, though only with permission of their male guardians, of course. It was thought polite by his host not to mention the beheadings and crucifixions of teenage demonstrators asking for the right to vote.
As a display of double standards, and Britain sets the gold standard on hypocrisy, it has been breathtaking. Here to discuss it is British academic Sami Ramadani. Dr. Sami, thanks for coming on board the Sputnik again. This man, just 33 years old, is effectively the absolute ruler now of Saudi Arabia. Is his rule contested? Has he prevailed over his enemies, who are, of course, his own relatives?
Sure. For the time being, he has prevailed with full backing of the United States, all sorts of security services and so on. They've been backing his project to come to power and to become the future king of Saudi Arabia, because his ambitions, his plans, his ideology suits very nicely the new aggressive phase of US policy, particularly in the region. So, and he's managed to eliminate most of the, if you like, opposition within the ruling family. But these ructions within the Saudi royal family are frequent, actually. They are not so rare. And they do lead to assassinations, sometimes even of kings and so on. So his rule is by no means stable, but he has managed to eliminate most of the opposition within the ruling family.
The expensively purchased public relations blitz that accompanies his visit to London suggests that he's actually popular in the country. And that might be true, mightn't it? Because he is young, he is stealing money from thieves and returning it to the country, which means him, because l'état c'est moi. He is undoubtedly making these liberal reforms about women and driving and the cinema and so on. You could see why he would be popular.
Well, I contest that he is popular, actually, because how do you gauge popularity in Saudi Arabia when nobody's allowed to open their mouths in any critical way whatsoever? And also there is extreme repression in terms of jails, in terms of torture in prisons.
And mass executions.
Mass executions, chopping people's heads, arms and legs and so on. And it's really a truly brutal state, Saudi Arabia.
So no change in that.
It's not an exaggeration at all, Gayatri. It is a really frightening place to be in. I know many people who come and go there, but it's a fearsome place if you are critical in any way of the regime.
Why do you think he opted for this PR blitz, which costed, what, 1 billion? And it has been received with mixed feelings.
Yeah, blitz
here, yes, exactly. I mean, I know we live in a social media age, but it's unprecedented, is it?
It is unprecedented with all these posters in London and on buses and taxis.
Billboards. We saw one at Westfield yesterday.
Electronic billboards and so on. Massive amount.
But not just on the street. You know that I have some random apps, and sometimes ads pop up, and even in random apps, his face pops up.
Yeah. I think it's a campaign essentially encouraged by Britain and by the United States, because he's going to go to the United States as well quite soon, to give an image of a young, dynamic leader who's reforming the country, who's giving rights to women. It's a sick joke in many ways. But really, because most people in the country are subjected to the media, and our media do not dwell on his crimes. They would rather talk about women will be able to drive as if this is a great achievement for the bulk of the oppressed Saudi women, and they give him this image of a reformer and so on. And what the Saudis are doing, the Saudi royal family are doing, is to if you like, back that image that the Western media tries to create for his rule. And you could see it everywhere in editorials and so on. I was reading in the last 2-3 days. It's quite astonishing how they want to give it this gloss.
Lipstick on a monstrosity.
Yep.
And the hypocrisy is breathtaking even for someone as long in the tooth as me. This is a country where the President of the United States cannot make a state visit for fear of negative response. It's a country where they wouldn't dream of inviting President Putin, for example, to come. And yet here they are inviting the head of a state as repressive as North Korea or any other state in the world, with a dictator every bit as much all-powerful as Kim Jong-un or anyone else. Yet we're expected to view this through rose-colored spectacles whilst being aghast at the possibility of others coming.
The hypocrisy is disgusting, actually, George and Beatrice. It's the sycophantic way even of addressing him and so on. And all because...
The Archbishop of Canterbury actually bowed to him.
Yes, yes.
It should actually have been the other way around.
It's quite amazing. And all
it's we
because
who are supposed to bow to religious leaders, not the other way around.
And all because Theresa May wants to sell him more bombs to kill the poor people of Yemen.
Not just Yemen. I want to turn now, if I may, to Syria. He didn't start the Saudi involvement, of course, in supporting the alphabet soup of head-chopping, heart-eating fanatics in Syria, but he's not going to change that policy either, is he? Is he doubling down in Yemen, doubling down in Syria, doubling down in the confrontation with Qatar?
Each one is obviously a different sort of conflict, but within the context of Syria and Iraq, by the way, Saudi Arabia is trying to entrench its position with some of these armed groups, so that if there is to be a solution, a diplomatic solution in Syria, Saudi Arabia will still have a strong influence through these armed groups and through the direct presence of the United States, because the United States now has sent thousands of soldiers to Syria. They are building, the US is building numerous military bases, what they call east of the Euphrates River. So you have a situation now where Saudi Arabia is trying to sabotage any settlement in Syria, which does not leave it with some direct influence in alliance with the United States. So, and that is in terms of Syria, and relatively in terms of Iraq as well, because the United States has decided also to send more troops to Iraq, or to leave the present troops that came in ostensibly to fight ISIS, while really ISIS were the front troops, in a sense, of US presence coming back into Iraq in a big way. So you have Saudi policy, you could see it mirroring what the United States really wants. If we want to understand what the Saudis are doing, we need to understand what the United States is doing. And in terms of their war on Yemen, they definitely had the green light from the United States and from Britain. That's why there is a joint commands room in Saudi Arabia in which US and British officers sit alongside Saudi officers directing the war on Yemen. But the Yemen one is a bog down. They are now really in trouble in Yemen, because although extremely poor country, the Yemeni people are famous for being very proud people, and they would not accept to be occupied or dominated completely by Saudi Arabia, which has had this ambition of controlling Yemen for many, many decades. So you have a history of Saudi Arabia playing the role of, if you like, the financier of US policies in the region, and more recently, and very uncharacteristically in the last few years, of openly engaging in armed conflicts and attacking neighbors, trying to encircle Qatar as part of the scenario. And this is a new type of role for Saudi Arabia, to come out in the open, because they used to do things in a very discreet way, financial support.
There's nothing discreet about MBS.
No.
Sami Ramadani, thanks for joining us on the Sputnik. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
Well, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia was here. Who could have missed that fact? And to that, Pure Lemon says, well, a Saudi king will meet a German queen in a palace built by some Viking descendants. Yep, That's Britain. And David Hart says billboards in Britain proclaim he's changing Saudi Arabia. Well, he's also changing Yemen. And finally, Roger the Dodger says, I have no problem with any visiting head of state, but I do have a problem with all media PR trying to whitewash the oppression faced by the Saudis and the neighboring citizens.
That's my own view, actually. I'm not against them being here. If you have relations with a country, then they have to be free to make state visits. What I deplore is the slavish obeisance of the political class and their media echo chamber.
Well, that's all the time we've got for the tweets today.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
But you can stay in touch with us on social media, on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today, or on Twitter and Instagram, RT_Sputnik. Goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.